This is a bell skiver. This one specifically is a Consew DCS S4. However, a lot of the bell skivers out there are going to look very similar because in one shape or another, they're clones of an old Fortuna design dated back to the early 1900s. There's a lot of videos out there on these machines, but they kind of talk about the different knobs and adjustments. But the thing I found frustrating about those videos when I was learning to use mine was they didn't do a very good job of explaining how the machine actually worked, just how to make adjustments. But if you don't understand how the machine works, you're probably going to have some trouble making intelligent adjustments to get the results you actually want. I've actually seen a machine where, or not a machine, but a video where the gentleman said, once you get it set, don't ever touch it again, just leave it be, which actually kind of irritated me and made me want to go through the documentation more. Because I think that's a really kind of coarse attitude towards that. You should really understand how you're using a machine, especially something like a bell skiver, which is a little bit dangerous, to be honest. There's some fast-moving, sharp parts that could hurt you. So you should really have a full grip on how this thing works. So I'm going to do my best to explain how these mechanisms work, and in the process, I'll end up talking about each of these knobs and each of the subsystems, but we're going to do this in a way that's focused on what's our intention versus what are the adjustments we're making first, if that makes sense. So a quick overview for the uninitiated. The knife spins, and just to be clear, my machine's set up with 2 servos, so my knife will spin independently of the feed wheel. A lot of people, if you have 1 servo, the knife is slaved off of the feed wheel servo, so when you press the pedal, they both spin at the same time. So I'm going to hit a switch and my knife is going to spin all by itself. So you can see that spinning, it's feeding away. And once the knife is spinning for me, the leather will go under the foot, and you can see the feed wheel. And I've actually got I've got it halfway disassembled, so it's easier to talk through the video. But you can see the feed wheel spin, and ultimately it will push. That feed wheel is gonna push the leather up against that foot, across the knife, and the knife is gonna split off that bottom portion. So the first thing I want to talk about is the foot. This sets the depth and the angle of the skive, and moves the foot moves relative to the knife. So we'll come to back. This knob up here will lift and lower the foot, so you can kind of see. I know the camera's a little bit further away, but as you crank it to the left counterclockwise, it's going to pull it away, and as you push it down, it's going to get closer. There's another set of knobs back here that controls the angle. So this spring actually retains it, but there's a set. This screw will tilt it forward, and then the spring will push it back. My finger's acting like the spring right now. And there's also a second knob here that is a set screw. So once you have the position you want and the spring's happy, you will lock it into place by countersetting that knob. There is a little lifter bar I was playing with a little earlier. This will move the foot away so that you can get leather underneath it initially. Like if you're just trying to initiate a skive, and the leather is a little bit thicker than the bevel. Here, I'll pull off one of these, and you can kind of see the bevel. So you can see there's an angled bevel. It's not perfectly parallel, so it actually pushes the leather down and through. And that'll let you get it in initially, or if you want to slide a piece in partway and then push it down, the blade you'll be able to do a skive midway through a piece. These adjustments are pretty straightforward, and these are the ones you're most likely to make on a daily basis as a typical operator, especially if you're using a lot of the same types of leather. Next we have the knife itself. It spins. as I showed you earlier, and it can be adjusted to be closer or further away from the foot. In here, actually, let's see if I can do this. I have some spare ones here. So this is how the knife is. This is what a bell knife looks like. It looks like a bell, right? Even rings like one. So the foot, when it's on the machine, is going to sit forward of the bell, and the bell can move further away or it can move closer to the knife. And this is a spare one that I pulled off the machine. That's actually the crap steel that came from China. And if you actually want to move it closer or further away, this knob is what adjusts it. Mine came with a little slide-on handle because it takes a fair amount of torque to move that. Something to note about this knob, and I'm sorry, I'm reading notes here, so you'll have to bear with me. It's directional. It's got a directional clutch on it, so you can see it kind of floats right here, and you actually have to twist it. I don't know where, I don't want to mess with that one too much because it's a little bit of a pain to adjust. But you end up twisting it 6 or 7 times before it actually engages the clutch to move it in whatever direction you're trying to go. So as soon as you pull it too far out of that engagement, you end up having to do another 6 or 7 turns to get it to move the opposite direction, or even to move it in the direction you originally go. Now, the original Fortuna factory spec, like in the manual, has this foot sitting pretty darn close. So when it's sitting relative to that, actually switch hands. They have it spec'd at 0.2 millimeters, 0.2 of a millimeter for thin leathers. Or I guess I've got that backwards. So that's really close. And for thicker leathers, they spec it out to as much as 0.5 of a millimeter. So the range isn't very big, and I don't think in reality you're going to be tweaking that a whole lot. It's pretty forgiving, but that's something to keep in mind. The only times you'd expect you to adjust that knife location is after it's been set, and is when you sharpen it, it'll grind away material, and eventually it'll get out of spec, and you'll have to advance the knife further so you can grind more material and it's close enough towards the foot. And speaking of that, I'm going to show you just a couple of things. So you should be able to see that blue stone back there. That's the grindstone. So I'm going to turn this back on. And the grindstone is slaved off of the same shaft that drives the knife. So when I move this lever, well, actually, when I pull it out, it doesn't do anything. When you drop it down, it engages a clutch that drives a belt that spins the stone. Now, obviously my stone was spinning but not grinding against the steel, otherwise it would have made a lot more noise. This knob right here, and you can see it, will advance the grindstone closer or further away from the bell. I'm not going to get into sharpening the knife. General maintenance really deserves its own video, so I'm going to stop there and kind of move on, but that gives you an idea of what this knob specifically does, how to engage that knife, and what that relationship is. That was the most straightforward part of the video. The feed wheel is where some of the magic happens. For most people, if they work with a lot of similar leathers, they'll get this set up once and never have to touch it again. Then, if it ever gets out of adjustment, they're going to get frustrated for a couple days, fucking around with it, trying to get it where they want it, and finally settle back in, probably because they don't entirely understand how this thing works. So, as I mentioned before, the feed wheel actively presses the leather up into the foot and pushes it across into the knife blade, actually feeding it. So it has this compound armature, right? That allows you to adjust the dead stop position and pressure of the feed wheel in 2 axes. And I'll demonstrate those in a second. It actually lets you move this up and down. And right now I've got that unsprung, so it's easier to show you. So this wheel is going all up and down at the same time. I'm actually going to apply the spring. Get off there. And hang it on this armature. So now there's tension on this. So I can still move it, but you can see it's snapping down. This set screw will adjust the height of it. And right now, it's pretty close. So if I increase it, it's going to be further away. If I drop it down, it's going to come back up pretty close. I'd say I'm probably less than 1/2 millimeter away, typically. Now, I say it's a compound armature. I showed you 1 axis. This is the up and down. Now, this brass component hangs off of it and has basically the same functions. It has a set screw. Like here, I'm going to check the video. Yeah, it should be in frame. It has this set screw that adjusts the angle. And it has a spring that adjusts the tension. Do you see how that's tilting down? So if I go over here to what this looks like in a head-on kind of view is mine is sitting really close and parallel. So on that first armature that controls the vertical axis, it'll bounce up and down like this, all as one unit. The second axis will tilt it like this. And notice it's not like this. It only exclusively moves like this when you adjust that tension. Oh, and like I mentioned, this is the tension adjusting knob. This is the dead stop position. So you can actually set this to operate at an angle. I think you'll find that's pretty atypical, but we'll discuss the situation where you might want to use that in a minute here. But it also has another lock knob, just like this one, and as well as the foot does. I'm going to preface this next part by saying that most people are only going to ever need to set the angle once. Probably more than likely it's going to be perfectly concentric with the bell. So this is going to be sitting very much like this, very close. I don't think you're going to adjust the pressure. I should say this. You're going to set the angle once. It's going to be parallel, most typically. You're going to adjust the up and down pressure, and you might adjust that depending on how thick the leather is a little bit. But I really don't think most people are going to adjust this tension. I think you're going to set it once for your type of leather or whatever spectrum you work in, and you're never going to fiddle with it again. That said, there's a relationship between the two movements and the type of the skive you're doing. If you're doing a flat skive, so where you're not only are the wheel and the grindstone parallel, but also the foot and the foot and the blade are parallel, right? So you're effectively just doing a consistent amount of material. It's all getting shaved off at the same thickness. You're not tilting it to get a skive. It's all going to be like that. In those situations, you really want this wheel to only move up and down. You don't want it to tilt at all because you want that consistent pressure as you're doing a consistent flat cut. So to make sure the wheel doesn't tilt while you're doing that cut, you're going to crank up this tension. This tension is going to be greater than this tension, so that when it's dealing with that, it's like when it's compensating for that thickness, right? Because leather is a natural material. It's That's why it's even sprung, so we can compensate for the variance in thickness. You only want it to bounce up and down. If you're doing a angled skive, especially on thicker leather, you want the wheel to tilt before the whole thing drops. So you actually want it to do this. So if your foot is angled, and this end would raise up, you want it to do this. You want this to bounce away, so you have an established skive line on that side. This is going to make your skives more consistent. What I think you'll find, though, well, let me trace back. On those angled skives, when you want it to do that, you're going to actually drop the pressure on this. And I don't know if you can see this. There's a spring inside there. This is a set of hooks. This is really high pressure. This is very low pressure. So if I want to make it so that it tilts before the whole system drops, I'm going to crank up the pressure. So this is gonna take a lot of force, and I'm actually going to drop this pressure. So that'll come down. So now it gets easier. Oh, I increased it. That goes to show how often I actually change this over. So this gets easier as you loosen that nut, or rather that knob, rather. So if you're doing a Scott cut like that, all that said, I work with leathers that are typically under 2 millimeters, so around 5 ounces. I don't really have to adjust this very much. I stay pretty typically on the second or third notch, rather, of this hanger, and that gives me appropriate tension up and down. And it still gives me a lot of flexibility in angled skives without having to flip the tension. So now that we kind of have all these pieces together, we can set up the machine for what the desired skive is, right? I usually work on thin leather, like I mentioned. So the feed wheel is pretty close. This is pretty close to the bell. As I said earlier, it's probably less than 1/2 millimeter because I'm only compensating for so much. My default position is parallel to the knife, like I mentioned. The tilt tension is cranked up pretty high. Keep cranking it. The vertical tension is moderate. This lets me do most things I want to do. Now, let's say I decided I wanted to do an angle skive on some really thick leather, 5 millimeter, 6 millimeter, 12 to 13 ounces sort of deal. And I wanted it to be nice and clean. And I was following the Fortuna factory manual from the early 1900s. I'd set up the foot. Actually, go ahead and do that. So I'm going to let it out. So this foot, this end is much higher than this now. So I have my angle set. My tilt tension, I'm going to drop. I'm going to drop it way down. And I'm going to crank up this tension, like I mentioned. So that is as high as it's going to be because I want a really consistent point on that. So now it's going to take a lot of force for that to drop. However, it's going to tilt out of the way pretty easy, right? The other thing I might do if I'm working on leather that thick is I might actually increase the distance from the bell. That was actually, that was right. I just hit the stop knob. So I'm increasing the distance from the bell. So probably not that much, but probably another millimeter or two, just so it's because when you increase the distance or you drop it down, it actually changes the tension. Now, I've got it cranked up so high that it's kind of a moot point, but knowing that my leather is so thick, I don't want to necessarily force the wheel to constantly press against that, especially on the angled skive. I really want to tilt down and feed like that. So those are kind of the two extreme opposites of what your setup will be. I think knowing what kind of cut you're going to do instructs the way you're going to set up the machine, but within that, it depends on the leather you're using. It depends on how dense it is, how stretchy it is. There's going to be a little bit of playing within each of those spectrums. And I think once you got those principles together, though, you can start making informed adjustments rather than a shot in the dark hoping that you're going to get it right. I think that covered everything. Just a couple little things to touch. Knobs I didn't mention. This one is actually not an adjustment knob in the way the other ones are. It controls a scraper that's inside the bell. That's a little bit of a manual adjustment. But this just tightens or loosens that scraper. This isn't an adjustment knob. It is a retainer for the guide. So if you are, that's screwed in tight. You set it up, you can put it here in front of the foot and it'll let you set the distance of the skive. This is also another retaining, this actually retains the entire armature. So if I loosen that and remove this spring, the armature will be able to slide out. Oh, that's right. There's actually a pin in the back. I'm not going to pull the whole thing out, but you can start to see how it removes when you do that. So, tighten that back up. But that's just basically a service pin. Oop, I dropped it. That's a service pin that retains that and keeps it in place. So it's not a normal adjustment either. I think that covers everything that we care about for this particular video. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope that helped.